This video is going to go over the features and the sutures on the skull. So just to remind you, the sutures are the connections between the bones, and the features are the lumps, bumps, and holes. So we'll start with sutures. So when I look at this skull here, the first suture that we're going to focus on is this guy right across here. Between the frontal and the parietal bones, we have the coronal suture. So that again is the line that goes across the top of the skull. As we continue back, we have this sagittal suture that's between the right and the left parietal bones. So the sagittal suture right here, that's straight down the middle top of the skull. As we move to the back of the skull, you'll see that we've got a suture that kind of does an upside down V right here. That's called the Lambdoidal Suture, and that's going to separate the two parietals from the occipital bone on the back of the skull. So front to back, we've got coronal going across, sagittal going down, and then lambdoidal on the back. Last suture that is important to you is going to be on the side of the skull, and it's what we call the Squamosal Suture, and it's going to be between the temporal bone here and the parietal bone here. So it's this kind of curved, and it actually kind of curls up here. So it's a little bit of an S-shaped curve to that suture. That's the squamosal. Now as we move on to features, the first feature on your list is going to be the Superciliary Arches, which are basically going to be these two brow ridges right here. So the thickenings above the eye orbit. Now the next feature is going to be related to the eyes as well. It's called the Supraorbital Margin. So supra above, orbital the eye orbit. So we're looking at this edge right here. Now we're looking at the rim from the inside of the orbit to the outside. So it's one where you're going to have to kind of run your fingers across it, and it'll be either sharp or rounded, and that's a feature we will use for determining if the individual is male or female. Now, moving to the back of the skull, we have this protrusion in the center back of the skull. That's a feature called the external occipital protuberance. External because it's outside, occipital because it's on the occipital bone. Protuberance is just something that sticks out. Coming off of that occipital protuberance, we have these ridges right here and right here. Those are called the nuchal lines. That's where the neck muscles are going to attach to the skull. So you can kind of see those ridges. It's often easier to feel them than it is to see them. As we continue on the bottom of the skull, this big hole right here where your spinal cord comes out, that's called the foramen magnum. And then right next to that feature, I'm going to come up nice and close here, there's these little bumps right here, these kind of kidney bean shaped lumps. That's going to be where the skull sits on the vertebral column, and those are features called occipital condyles. Occipital because they're on the occipital bone, and a condyle is a joint. So you're going to see condyles in various different parts, but these are the occipital condyles. So we move to the side of the skull. Let me turn them right side up here. Okay. You'll see that we've got this big hole on the side. That's going to be your ear canal, or correctly termed external auditory meatus. External because it's the outside portion, auditory having to do with hearing, and a meatus is a tube, so that kind of breaks down that term. Now just behind that, we have this big lump. That big lump you can feel on yourself right behind your ear. It's called the mastoid process. So external auditory meatus, and right behind it is the mastoid process. Now, I'm going to switch over to the, oh wait a second, I'm going to do one more here. So this ridge right here, right, between the zygomatic bone and the temporal bone that catches it up here, that ridge is called the Zygomatic Arch. So even though this part right here is actually temporal bone, and this part zygomatic, we call the whole thing the Zygomatic Arch. And that's where the muscles fit underneath, and underneath that is the sphenoid bone. So now I'm going to switch over to the mandible really quick.